I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Hult International Business School at this time. I've had effectively 3 careers. I spent the early part of my life as an academic economist, sort of all the usual things that you'd expect from an academic economist around research, teaching, and the like. I then spent a dozen years of my life in the management consulting world, McKinsey, CEB, and the like, giving advice typically around a lot of technology sector issues, but have worked in a number of different sectors. And then the last 10 years have been a call of passion to come back to education and ask the question of how can we think of doing it differently. The world is changing. I think we need to bring significant change to higher education. And so I've had the chance to be in executive education at the University of Maryland, being chief academic officer at Hult, had a wonderful opportunity to go back to the United World College, my alma mater, and be president of the school. And just in the last 2 years have come back to Hult, which has been one of the more entrepreneurial educational institutions I've ever been involved with the sense of saying, how do we innovate? How do we think about new learning experiences, new products, new business models? So a pretty broad canvas in terms of change we can make happen via what we do at Hult, which is a top 100 ranked business school, is distinctive because it's particularly global with campuses around the world, from San Francisco all the way to Shanghai, and a student body that's more than 125 countries of the world at this time. Look, we've done a ton of things. Let me focus on things that I've been working on in the last year or two as part of my Chief Innovation Officer role. Probably 3 areas to pick on. First is around curriculum, right? It remains for education one of the most leveraged points of change there is. And we started in a journey at Hult several years ago, but when I was Chief Academic Officer about 5 years ago, we brought in a new curriculum that was very focused on soft skills. We did all the traditional things you'd expect in a business school curriculum, but as we went and talked to 100 CEOs out there and asked what they wanted to see different in a business education, not just Hult's, any business education, they really pushed us to say, well, could you get graduating students to be better communicators, to be better collaborators, to have better problem-solving skills? Many of them pointed to the fact that most business schools don't have courses on sales, which is what, frankly, all of us in business eventually do some amount of. So we made significant changes to the curriculum at that point in time. And as I came back, the world has moved pretty significantly as we look at the range of new technologies and new business models that are becoming pervasive. And I'm hugely inspired by the work of Ray Kurzweil and the Singularity. We've brought in the thought of what is the mindset that our students need for the future. And so we've been able to package our curriculum into 3 areas. We've always been very global. We continue to push that. We think there's a big need for growth mindset and soft skills, which we brought 5 years ago, which we continue to do. And now we've added the theme of how do we prepare you from the perspective of future, which has a lot to do with technology, a lot to do with data, a lot to do with new business models, and the mindsets that are needed to deal with a rate of change that is faster, a level of uncertainty that's different. You've heard the term VUCA, and we certainly live it today. And so we've been able to put in place or start the journey of a curriculum which covers global growth or soft skills for you, as well as a future orientation. And that's been significant for us. To double click into that future orientation in a second big area that my teams have gone after in the last year, which we're immensely proud of, and we've been nominated for multiple awards in this area, is around our nano courses on exponential technologies. So we've built courses in 9 different areas, things like self-driving cars, robotics, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, future of energy, etc., where we want our students, business students, to understand the basics of those technologies, to understand the use cases, the regulatory challenges, the technological challenges, the current competitive arena, and to be able to look into the future and ask the question of where are the right use cases and business models, and what's going to hold all of that back. We need the business people of tomorrow to be more technologically aware and facile than they've had to be in the past. And we found ways to make that happen. We've had to experiment a fair bit with blended learning of various kinds to make that happen. It's not easy to, at the same time, get the blockchain expert to be in our Shanghai campus and our San Francisco campus. So we've had to play a fair bit with blended and online, but that's been quite successful for us, and we're really looking forward to seeing how this progresses into the future. So curriculum's been one big area. A second big area that I'm pretty focused on right now is the dimension of skills. And this in many ways crosses both into degree, non-degree kind of activity. In many ways, the new currency of tomorrow is skills. If you look at job descriptions today, and we use things like burning glass data to mine the data on what are the kinds of skills that are in demand, how is that changing, how does that vary by geography. And really, there's a huge need to get to the point of saying, for particular jobs, learners need to invest in a few skills, maybe 1, 2, 3 skills, not the 50 plus that they may be taught in a degree program. So how do we find small interventions that can allow them to build those skills? And a second theme that's particularly important in that area is to think about skill levels, because skills are not binary. It's not that you're just that you're a good professional speaker or not, or a good public speaker or not. There's going to be levels of competence on it, and we're putting together a set of offerings which allow skills to be built at different levels of competency through a variety of blended programs. We're still adjusting the how do you make this be high touch but low cost? How do you make it social? How do you make it skill and practice driven? How do you make certification happen real time? So numbers of issues to deal with, but the whole area of upskilling learners is a big one for us. And probably the third and last one I'll mention is around, we've just launched a partnership, Embark at Hult, on our San Francisco campus about a month ago. We're inviting educational technology startups to come spend time on our physical campus effectively to use space in our co-working lab there to conduct their edtech business out of our campus, with the sense that, and I certainly have this belief very strongly, that some of the challenges in terms of educational technology adoption have been that edtech firms are not close enough to their customers, to schools. And you said, why don't we go back sort of to something of an older notion and saying, come co-locate, spend time around our students, around our faculty, present brown bags, and that's going to help evolve the product more quickly. They'll get better suggestions from those who are going to be users of those products. Certainly gets us, Hult, into the flow of where's the frontier of educational technology ideas. We're delighted about this partnership that's just kicked off with the Entangled Ventures, and we're soon going to have edtech startups on our campus, and we think the flows of information and the feedback that's going to allow much better product to come out quicker is just going to be absolutely fabulous. Frankly, at the end of the day, the advice is simple. It's a just do it. It is important. It is critical for our learners, and we're all doing this because of what we want to achieve for our learners. We have to be willing to take risk. We do have lots of stakeholders. We do have the challenge that there are many different points of view that need to be worried about. Our institutions are typically set up to be quality gatekeepers, which we absolutely need, but we're not very good at separating out, where we can take risk and where we can't. We tend to sort of use the same governance process for every project, and that gets pretty challenging for us. But I think we're at the point in time, the analogy I like to use is, if you think of self-driving cars, the massive progress there comes from the fact that a self-driving car learns from the experience of all miles, all cumulative miles that have been driven. because the algorithm, the sensors are benefiting from it all the time. Unlike the human driver or the analog driver, where yes, I benefit from experience, but it's only my own experience. I can't benefit quickly enough from the experience of the millions and hundreds of millions that have driven before me. We're at a point in time with our digital learning processes where I think we can start to learn from that digital footprint. And so I think we should be very excited about that. I find a ton of my faculty are getting very excited about that and excited about how they can teach differently at scale. It is hard. There will be failures. We have to be humble about it. We have to be very willing to admit our mistakes. And frankly, we have to be very upfront with our students when we conduct experiments and pilots. We always are. We make them part of the journey. And in many ways, I've found our student learners have just been absolutely spectacular as we do pilots. They get so engaged. They come up with great ideas about how they want to learn in the future. So, very simple one. Get in, try, do small pilots, be willing to accept failures, pivot quickly. And I think the digital footprint as we collect it is going to give us a massive. We've been primarily face-to-face driven. We've been focused on very high touch, well-designed experiences, very carefully crafted, very focused on practical learning. Ashridge certainly for some time has had virtual Ashridge. We have an EMIM degree there. But our focus has been on saying, how do we make that in-person experience be amazing? We've worried a ton across the last years about, are we building the last dinosaur here? As we build more campuses, as we continue to invest in that face-to-face experience, there is a reality of the world is moving, and we need to look at it ourselves. The significant theme I'm focused on is, how do we make sure that online experiences are going to be better and different than the face-to-face? It's not interesting to simply replicate what we do in the classroom in an online experience. And that's the way most technology goes in the early days. I think we're starting to get to a point where we can say, look, let's actually use technology to allow us to do things online, whether it is by way of flexibility, whether it is by way of being able to practice something, whether it is by way of how you give peer feedback and coaching, number of areas we're looking at, where you can start to do things that are pretty unique in the online space. And that's what I'm pretty focused on, is how are we going to think about a great experience, great engagement, and frankly start to think of things that we aren't able to do in person in our classrooms, just because we tend to have students for relatively short periods of time, in short bursts, when you can imagine having them attached to you from a lifelong perspective. How can you start to deliver some very different experiences? Look, like I said, we're sort of relatively early in the journey at Hult on this, but if I look more broadly across the industry, I think two themes, and let me catch them in the order you mentioned them. One, engagement, right, and creating engaging experiences, and the bar on this changes as we experience in our daily life, whether it is through Netflix, whether it is through your Amazon shopping experience, or the variety of other channels we interact with on a daily basis. Our expectations for how learning will happen start to very quickly conform to those benchmarks, rather than the theme of, let me be a little unfair and talk about, 10 years ago, the story of being able to just record video and put everything online. That's not a compelling experience. Just sitting there and watching a whole bunch of video is, especially on dry, boring topics, is not going to be particularly compelling. So how do you create the right level of interaction between learners? How do you create the right level of interaction between the content and the learner? Being able to have activity happen very quickly and frequently. And there's a lot of neuroscience that's helping us think about how quickly we need to give the brain a break, how quickly we need to remind the brain of what it's learned so far. We need to do a lot more work to build that engagement into the learning experiences. I start to see some interesting tools emerging. I'm very fond of talking about nudging. This is a little bit my economist past talking, but thinking about how we nudge learners towards the next bit of learning. How do we scaffold their learning through a variety of nudges is important. But I think that engagement is still not at the level that our learners are used to in the rest of their lives, and we've got to catch up and move past. I think the second area of enrollment, the biggest theme that I worry about in education, higher education, undergraduate education, thinking lifelong education, is how do people get advice on what they should study next, right? And in many ways, when things were slower, with sort of the way things happened for me, I did high school, it was okay. You're pretty good at math and science, you should go be an engineer. A very standard path to take for most people. There's eventually okay, here's a graduate degree you should pursue at some point. Look, as complexity is increasing, as job markets are changing, we're going to have to get much better at helping individuals get advice on what skill they need to build next, on what learning they need next. And it's pretty challenging for a learner out there. There's a plethora of courses from a range of organizations. And as a learner, as a novice learner, it's pretty hard to figure out. Is this going to be valuable? Is it going to be time efficient? How do I get there? And so I think that the industry overall is going to have to figure out ways to be, I believe, more data-driven in helping learners figure out what they study next. If we can solve that challenge of giving them good advice, I think we'll make some good strides. True, online and in person, that folks are going to be very focused. When I think about where we've been at Hult, we offer primarily one-year degree programs, and I hear it from lots of students. They're very clear the ROI on a one-year program versus the traditional US two-year MBA or other master's programs is very real and different, and they clue into that even for face-to-face experiences. But what I'd argue is, look, we're going to have to ask the question significantly about what's the right sized educational intervention. At this point, even in this conversation, as we talk, there's a lot of, well, the right size is a degree. That's the simplest thing for most people to think of. That's the advice that lots will get. How do we think about what is the right size of intervention? And for a career change, for instance, here's some math that we did. We took some data from the likes of a Burning Glass. You go mine all of the data on the jobs that are currently available. You look at what skill sets are needed to advance to that job. And we looked at the question of, look, if somebody were to add, let's call it 3 skills at certain levels of competency, how much of a job hop could they get? And what kind of compensation jumps could they get? And we were quickly able to identify, if you get three additions of skill, and if you look at wanting a $20,000 to $25,000 salary increment, there's a pretty large proportion of the global market that can quickly achieve that kind of a job hop. I think that's going to be pretty compelling to folks to say, look, I can have career progression by adding a few skills. I need the right sized personalized intervention for that. But it doesn't have to be a year of my time. I think if we can right size our education and add in the component of helping people have clarity around what paths do they have available in front of them, and near-term paths as well as longer-term paths. Because look, what's changed is, I used to hear this from my father, who carried his career with Tata's company in India, right? And I had changed jobs a couple times by the time I was 10, 12 years into my career, and we had a conversation about that change. Look, I'm just reflecting my age here more than anything else, but the future certainly is going to be made up of far more job hops. There's a lot of need to help navigate those job hops, and I think connecting job hops with salary increases, with skill building, and with the possibility of building an asset base towards your next career is hugely important. I think online makes that much easier. You're able to access as needed. It can be more personalized. It can be far more data driven for us. Two changes to talk about. I think certainly businesses are expecting uh, far far more continuous engagement as educational interventions happen. So even when you have programs where students will come to Ashridge Castle, executives will come to Ashridge Castle for 3 or 4 days, there's more of an expectation of how will we connect with them before, how will we connect with them after, how do you weave the learning process into their daily lives in a far more significant way. That requires us to think about a variety of tools. It requires us to bring in some new pedagogies. It gives us some great opportunities in terms of saying, look, we'll teach you sets of behaviors, mindsets, and some skills in our in-person interventions, but we can give you access to a lot more capabilities when you're back in your office or on the road or have downtime. And so that opportunity to weave the digital into the in-person is certainly expected by our business partners, but I think it also offers us some great opportunities. I think the second theme that's happening significantly from a lot of businesses is the desire to engage a much larger part of their workforce, to step away from just the top levels of executives to a significantly larger proportion of the company, because decision making is happening across the enterprise. That's a theme that look, we're still working on. I think there are sets of programs that we are able to offer that help with that, but I think there is room for a lot more as we look across a broader base of individuals from any company. I'd offer a couple points. One, if you look at it, we're very much able to offer to learners online the opportunity to connect in particular parts of the world. We offer courses on the executive education side, on the Ashford side, around the world, but we have significant presence, of course, in the UK, but also in Dubai. We spend a lot of time in China as well. And there's opportunity for us to do some pretty interesting things on the ground. And that's hugely valuable. We also get asked very often to use our other campuses. So, I can think of a group that in the next couple of months is going to be headed over to San Francisco to our campus there, spending time in Silicon Valley, learning about some innovation and entrepreneurship themes there. Being able to combine assets and having campuses around the world is very helpful in allowing us to create great experiences on the ground, which really resonate with executives. I think there's a way in which, and I've been a little surprised by this. I mentioned earlier the nano questions from each other, and it was fabulous to have students from around the world. They quickly sort of dove in, did some projects looking at their country or a country they were particularly interested in, and very quickly, instead of having just the perspective from one part of the world, we were having great conversations about, certainly the US has allowed for lots of testing to happen, but we had students from India talking about how might this work in the city of Mumbai, folks from I remember somebody from Nigeria talking about it. So you very quickly got a world which is converging, starting to talk about the rates at which it is converging and how they could learn from each other. I think it's an absolute joy to watch something like that happen. Look, scaling is a challenge. Much of education, and I've shared this example before of if I think about driving in my own experience as a driver, I've learned mostly from my experience and those who taught me. But unfortunately, I don't tap into the daily experience of the hundreds of millions who drive. But as we start collecting data, self-driving cars benefit from all of that experience. And we're asking the question of how do we make sure that we benefit? How does the learner benefit? I'll give you one very tangible example. I've been teaching with this approach for some time, where I have students record videos and do peer feedback on various given topics. A chance for somebody to practice a skill, to have peers provide some critique on that skill, as well as an instructor to be able to provide it and to model it. Well, look, this is an area where the more data we collect, the more instances we have of specific observation and the feedback that was attached with it, we can create opportunities where a student doesn't have to wait for an instructor to give feedback. We can, with some clever matching, be able to provide very personalized feedback on what they are saying, eventually bringing an instructor along. And I think that's going to be massive for us. Another version of that, we haven't implemented this yet, but I hope we will in the years ahead. I talk about the chance for a student to be able to write a paper or do an assignment and then be able to submit it to an automated scoring system, which gives it feedback, not from the perspective of a summative experience, a summative assessment, which is going to sort of be recorded, but more from the perspective of saying to the student, you got some feedback, you can rewrite your assignment, improve it. And I found small instances where, given that kind of feedback, students will put in 3, 4, 5 iterations, and their work product will get much, much better by the time it gets to the faculty member for final assessment. Those are the mechanisms where, with scale, we're going to be able to provide them personalized and very specific feedback. We're still going to have quality themes around summative assessments and thinking about accreditation that we will always worry about. But I think collecting those digital footprints, thinking about the intelligence that comes from instructors and peers getting codified in, and then having algorithms that can do some matching is going to be very powerful in terms of real-time feedback, which unfortunately relatively small numbers of people are able to afford at this point in time. I'd say this is probably where much of the industry is fairly close and similar. We have lots of in the experiences we create, we have lots of synchronous moments, and certainly in the courses in which I instruct, I find once you create breakout rooms, the right kind of discussion experiences, sometimes do some online simulations, the moment those interactions and engagements are getting real and deep, there's a bond that forms decently quickly online as well. Certainly better when we can bring them for a couple days in person. I don't know that I don't know that we have any magic silver bullets on that one, but there's a number of themes in just creating more interactions that certainly builds sets of connections. And I certainly find students who come back and say, hey, I need to connect further with person XYZ. The biggest surprise, and I've had this, and certainly students say it, is people end up being shorter or taller than you expect them to be on video. It's just the reality of how our cameras go. So you have those moments that people worry about, but I think creating good interactions, intense interactions online is a pretty good start. What's exciting about trends and technologies? Well, the growth and demand. I think we're going to have a lot more learners participate in learning, and I think that's absolutely fabulous. I see much better collaborative and social experiences coming online. I think there's still ways to go, but there are technologies that are helping this, and this is a space where AR, VR, and other forms will probably help us in the future. I think a third trend that I'm pretty excited about is what I'm seeing from faculty and experts, a desire to experiment, a desire to think about scale, a willingness to try new roles and get away from sort of the theme of I have to just be the content expert, but facilitating experiences, facilitating learning journeys. I think that's going to lead to some interesting things. And probably the fourth area that I'm most keen to see expand, so let me put this out as a plea for folks. I think of psychometrics, and sort of gaming interventions as being pretty interesting. I think gaming is something that easily attracts people. I think as we think more about psychometrics, and we do a lot of work with psychometrics, particularly at Ashridge, I think there are some connections, correlations in there where we can provide better profiles of learners, better views of how we could give them advice. And I hope both of those areas will continue to blossom and have some good outcomes for us. What do I see for online education a decade out? Look, this is the good news about the VUCA world we live in. We just have to point in a direction. It's hard to imagine plans 10 years out. But I think if I were to pick 3 areas, I'd say, one, we're going to see a lot more personalization in education, both in the advice around what you should do, as well as in terms of experiences, learning experiences for individuals. Second, I think we're going to be a lot more focused on practice and skill building. We'll certainly always have sort of big theoretical areas, big knowledge areas to pursue. But I think we're going to start spending a lot more time on saying, how do I build a particular skill? And the best way to build most skills remains very intensive practice, very intensive feedback. And I think these are areas that we're going to continue to invest in as an industry very significantly. And I think last, certification will always be important, or at least in the near term, 10 years it will be. And I see us moving towards certifications that acknowledge the skill building that's happening, the confidence that a learner is gaining, and figuring out ways to do that in, well, maybe not quite real time, but near real time is something I would start to expect